Welcome back to the Eco Impactors podcast. My name is Blane, and today myself and Amy are joined by Aaron Gekoski, an environmental photojournalist and filmmaker specializing in human-animal conflict. So Aaron, cheers for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Blane and Amy.
No worries at all. So there's a few questions to kind of get stuck into for this podcast. Been following you for a while now, so it's kind of looking forward to asking you a few questions. But to get us started, can you please tell the podcast a bit about who you are, what you do, and maybe a bit about how you kind of got into this space as well?
Yeah, of course. Well, I think you summarized it quite nicely there. Yeah, I'm primarily an environmental photojournalist and filmmaker, covering all the fun areas such as wildlife crime, exotic pet trade, deforestation, wildlife tourism. So really kind of exploring mankind's complex relationship with wildlife. I've been doing this now for nearly 15 years. I used to kind of work in the corporate world, and then I had a modeling agency in London in my mid-20s, but then, you know, very kind of unhappy with the lifestyle and the person I was becoming, and decided to try and head off into the wild and sort of emulate my hero, David Attenborough. So I went and did a wildlife filmmaking course in South Africa. And originally the goal was to kind of showcase the beauty of the natural world, much like Attenborough did, particularly in his early days. But then when I got out there and I started kind of investigating and digging under the surface, I found that things weren't kind of quite as they seemed in those BBC documentaries. And everywhere we turn, wildlife is being hammered from all angles because of the impact of mankind's activities. So what I learned was that we are in the midst of a sixth mass extinction event. Every year, thousands of species are becoming extinct. So then I've spent the last, over a decade traveling the world, investigating these stories, looking at everything from seals being culled in Namibia to deforestation in Borneo to more recent projects which has looked at the exploitation of animals for entertainment. Made a couple of broadcast documentaries recently about the exotic pet trade. Because for me as well, these stories are much more interesting, they're much richer, they're much more complex than going out and just showing animals in their natural habitat. It's also, I think these stories are much more important because of some of the threats that these animals are facing. And you're currently contemplating a world without great white sharks, without manta rays, without elephants or lions. So really, I think as photographers, we all have an opportunity to use our skills for the good of the planet.
Is it interesting that you were inspired by David Attenborough? You kind of wanted to go into the space and kind of showcase the beauty. And it's quite interesting that that was your original intention. And then the niche that you're in at the moment is kind of you're showcasing not the beauty, but the kind of the other side of things, maybe the darker aspects to, the natural world in terms of how we have influenced it. And I think that contrast between the beautiful David Attenborough docos are really good. They inspire people, but that kind of needs to be contrasted with the other side of things, which does exist and needs to be showcased as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think probably even by Attenborough's own admission, he maybe spent too much time just making out that the world was this great harmonious place full of animals running around in the wild. And it's actually only been over recent years that he's been a lot more vocal about conservation and some of the threats facing wildlife. Look, we all have difficult lives, particularly at the moment in a post-COVID world. And people don't just want to be bombarded with negativity and depressing stories. So it's our role as filmmakers and photographers is not to just show the negative side all the time. So we have to convey that there is hope as well, which can be very difficult. That's a real challenge, because what I have seen over the last 13 years is that we're in deep shit. Like, we are in trouble like we've never been before. But if you just say that to people, then nobody's going to watch your documentaries and nobody's going to look at your photos. I mean, even, you know, I produced a book last year called Animosity, which looked at the stories that I've covered all around the world. I think only one family member has ever even opened it or read the book because they find the material too distressing. So yeah, that's something that that's a real battle that we're kind of facing at the moment, is how do we get people to pay attention to these issues without overwhelming them and making them feel like there's no hope at all.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting challenge. I mean, I think about that quite a lot, this getting that balance right between, you know, what you communicate, the challenges, the good things, the bad things, because people working in the space, the primary thing that we want is for change, positive change to happen. And positive change happens through people acting through their actions. So if the primary objective is to kind of increase the amount of positive actions, how do we get to that point? You know, what is that balance between, you know, inspiring David Attenborough documentaries? How much positive action does that have? Maybe some of the work that you do, some more of the graphic sort of things. What's the conversion rate of those sorts of things? Like, what's that? I think in terms of like quantifying things, and that's probably maybe the wrong way to approach it. But like, is there that formula? Is there a formula?
It's very, very difficult to quantify the success of a campaign. I mean, there's various ways that you can do it. So I've just been out to Indonesia, and I went to Vietnam, and I was documenting exotic animal markets and the dog meat trade. The client, off the back of that, they put out a big survey, and the goal of the survey was to lobby the government to actually do something about the trade. And so far, in a week, the survey has had 30,000 signatures. I mean, that's a pretty solid way of quantifying the success of a campaign. Then what actually happens after after this? I mean, that's more difficult to measure. A lot of the time, the places that you're exposing and the countries or governments that you're being critical of, they don't want to have this negative publicity, particularly in Asian markets where it's all about losing face. And if suddenly you have negative stories that are plastered all over the media, then it can kind of shame governments into action. But look, success is measured in a multitude of ways. There can be quantifying something in the form of getting not a survey. What's the word I'm looking for? What's the word? Petition.
Yeah, I was going to say petition.
Sorry,
signatures.
petition, not a survey. Sorry, I'm in the midst of working on my latest sort of global documentary. My head is absolutely fried. So if I'm saying things that aren't completely making sense, then feel free to jump in correctly. So yeah, success comes in many forms. It can be in the form of a government going in and shutting a zoo down off the basis of one of my investigations. It can be someone who's just got in touch and said, look, I've seen your Instagram account, and because of that, I now know more about the dog meat trade in Indonesia. And now I've gone out and I've been educating my children about it. So yeah, there's many different barometers to what success is what I'm kind of trying to get about in a roundabout way.
Yeah, I think that's great. There is such a balance as well, and it's hard to find, but I think every kind of educator in this area, in the field of animal welfare, has their role as well. And, you know, you need that kind of versatility to show different faces in this huge market.
Yeah, well, sorry, I don't mean to butt in, but what I kind of always try and say to people is, like, not everyone wants to do what I'm doing or has the resources to go out and be out there on the kind of front line. But we all have an opportunity to make the world a better place for animals, whether you're just reading more about it, or you're going and you're sharing stories on social media, or you're donating to reputable NGOs. And then you have the people who are, you know, able to or have the desire to dedicate a little bit more time. You have the Paul Watsons of this world who are really, you know, shaking things up and very much on the front line. So look, but just by people listening to this now, by listening to this podcast, they're doing their part, and I hope that people will come away
Exactly.
with more knowledge about conservation because of this.
Yeah, education is definitely key, and awareness in this space.
Yeah,
I'd
whether
love
you're an
to.
educator or whether you're a scientist or a photographer or a parent, really kind of there's no excuses for not educating people about the plight facing animals at the moment.
Very true. I'd love to know, because you've worked on so many different projects, from Thailand's wildlife tourism industry to the incredible Eyes of the Orangutan documentary, and the dog meat trade and the exotic pet trade. There's so many projects that you've worked on. Do you have a most passionate or loved project? They're not the most positive projects, but do you have a most passionate one?
The most passionate one is the one I'm always currently working on, because when you work on these projects, you throw yourself in wholeheartedly and you completely immerse yourself in it. And I've gone to work on stories or subjects or species that I knew absolutely nothing about. And then by the end of it, you become this, crazy advocate for this particular animal or subject, because you now, I wouldn't say you become an expert about it, but you become informed on the matter. And it's only when you become informed or educated that you genuinely are able to care or have that empathy for your subject. So I did a story about the tortoise mafia in Madagascar, about how armed gangs of poachers are going into villages and then raiding them of tortoises and then exporting them around the world for the exotic pet trade. And of course, I knew nothing about this story before going in there. But then after a few weeks in Madagascar, suddenly, I was in love with this animal, and I was genuinely passionate about the plight of tortoises in Madagascar. So really, yeah, it really depends. And you have to have that ability in this line of work. Once you've finished on a project, you kind of have to clear yourself mentally of it, because then you have to immerse yourself in the next one. And you can't be doing that wholeheartedly if you still have sort of remnants of X projects rattling around in your brain. So yeah, in answer to your question, the one I'm most passionate about is the one I'm currently
when you said the most present one, when you were just talking about the importance of understanding something, that just made me think of a Jane Goodall quote, which I've just brought up, so I'll just quickly say it. Only if we understand can we care. Only if we care we will help. Only if we help we shall be saved. So it's kind of like there's this sequence of things that need to happen in order to get the outcome that we all want. So the saving or the protection of the environment. When you kind of go back to the first step that kind of instigated that process, it's the sense of like understanding. So what can we do? What content can we consume? What experiences can we have to kind of develop this understanding of the natural world? And that's kind of the first step. And these other positive things that we're trying to get to kind of happen as a byproduct of that. Right. Sorry, I had a question going back to, there's different ways to kind of measure the success of a campaign or a project. Do you have like for the work that you do, is there like a particular outcome that you try and have through your work? Is there like how do you measure the success of your projects?
I think that's normally defined at the start of the project, so it really depends on a lot of it, because these are most of their client led, so it depends. The NGO might approach us and say, what we want to do is we want to educate. We don't just want to be preaching to the converted here with this documentary, we want to be reaching new audiences, because there's nothing more frustrating as well than making films for conservationists. So yeah, it really, again, it's very much on a project by project basis. Yeah, it could be, reaching new audiences. It could be getting 100,000 signatures on a petition. It could be to put pressure on the government to change legislation. So it's yeah, it's really on a project by project basis.
Yeah. Case by case. That makes sense.
Mm.
Yeah.
I suppose a follow-up question to that one is looking towards solutions, but first of all, the problems. What do you think the main problems are? And where are the gaps in the solutions that are coming on board now in the world, just in general, or if you wanted to focus on a specific project?
Well, maybe I think we could talk about wildlife tourism here, because that's the project that I've just been working on, and that's related to Eyes of the Orangutan. So what are the problems with wildlife tourism? Well, first of all, the industry exists because people want to have close encounters with wildlife. They want to be able to see an orangutan in person, but they don't have the money or the will to travel to the jungles of Indonesia or Malaysia. So what do we do about that? So over recent years, we have seen the explosion in the zoo industry. But the problem is that most of these places, they are not, they don't have sufficient resources to be able to care for the animals properly. They don't have enough veterinary care. They don't have enough land to ensure that the animals have enough space in their enclosures. They don't feed them the correct diets. They overfeed them or they underfeed them. A lot of the time with orangutans, you will see in wildlife tourism attractions, they're obese because they're being overfed and they don't have enough room to move around. They also, they get incredibly depressed. An orangutan, as you guys of course know, is 97% DNA shared with humans. They're one of the most intelligent animals on the planet. So they need stimulation. But in a wildlife tourism attraction, they don't have that. They don't have trees to climb. They don't have, any of the necessary tools in order to enrich their lives at a wildlife tourism attraction, and they just sit around being essentially human playthings. So the wildlife tourism industry is fraught with problems, and we could dedicate an entire podcast to this issue. Many of the places, they say that they are centers for education and scientific research and conservation. But I can tell you that 99.9% of people who go to a zoo, they don't learn anything at all. Also, a lot of the animals that are kept in zoos and are involved in breeding programs, they're not even endangered. So this is just essentially a way of them greenwashing the work that they're doing. Most wildlife tourism attractions and zoos, they're not about education. They're exploitative money-making machines. And that was something that I didn't know necessarily before embarking on this mission maybe 4 or 5 years ago, which has taken me around the world. I've visited probably 50 to 100 zoos. And yes, some are better than others, but overall, I think that zoos are definitely not a good thing for the species. They're not a good thing for individual animals, and they don't contribute anything at all.
Interesting. The wildlife tourism is a really interesting industry. It's an industry that I'm kind of passionate about, in the sense of kind of combating a lot of the negative things that happen there, because that kind of started that was a spark for my conservation journey. Was when I was visiting Thailand 6 years ago. I was completely oblivious to the dark side of elephant tourism that can exist there. And so I unwillingly supported sanctuaries, and then kind of just had this thing in the back of my head, like something doesn't seem right. And then that started me kind of researching it further and kind of learning about that sort of a thing. And that was a spark for me kind of pivoting from architecture, which was just my background. That's what I studied at uni, into trying to do something in this space, which is a space that I've always been passionate about, but kind of didn't really know how I could contribute.
Yeah, well, that's a good one. A lot of people, they don't want to be going to wildlife tourism attractions and for the animals to be coming to any harm. And the same, like you, I was exactly the same in Thailand. 15 years ago, I was riding around on elephants, and you're fed all these lines about how they're rescued and how well they're taken care of. And a lot of these places are very well oiled in that sense, and they are very good at pulling the wool over customers' eyes and dressing themselves up as conservation centers. So how do you know as a consumer which are the good places and which aren't? And it's very difficult. It's very difficult. Partly I set up Raise the Red Flag with Born Free Foundation, and the goal was to have a platform that was dedicated to this, almost kind of like a TripAdvisor, but for wildlife tourism attractions. So if you see something going on that you're concerned about, you can make a report on Raise the Red Flag platform, and then eventually it is logged on the platform. And then, you know, if you're interested in going to an elephant sanctuary in Chiang Mai, you can go on to Raise the Red Flag and you can check and you can see if it's had negative reviews. So that's one way. But other ways, people have to really do their research first, go online, look at images, read reviews. If there are any negative reviews that set some alarm bells ringing, then maybe it's somewhere that you shouldn't visit. Because overall, I could probably count on only one or two hands the really reputable rescue centers that I would recommend that people go to. There's not many of them at all.
Maybe on that point, what constitutes a reputable rescue center or sanctuary or wildlife tourism? Like what are the properties or characteristics that constitute an ethical sanctuary?
Yeah, well, I should point out that this isn't necessarily my area of expertise. First of all, I'm primarily a photographer and a filmmaker, so I can only comment on what I have learned or seen down the years. First of all, I'd say a genuine rescue center, so somewhere that rescues animals from poor zoos or from bad wildlife tourism attractions, that are run by people who have a solid reputation, and it's quite easy to find out who those people are. I'll give one example is Lek Chalat, who rescues elephants out in Thailand. Or the wildlife, also Thailand, the Wildlife Friends Foundation. They're also amazing. Borneo Orangutan Survival in Kalimantan in Indonesia also do incredibly good work, who feature in our film Eyes of the Orangutan. So then once you have animals that have been rescued and taken to the center, are there then genuine programs that are in place in order to rehabilitate those animals and release them back into the wild? We have to be realistic that not all animals that are rescued from wildlife tourism attractions can then be released into the wild, because they are so used to human contact. A lot of them wouldn't last a second in the wild. So Borneo Orangutan Survival, they have an amazing jungle school where the animals are really put through their paces to ensure to educate them for then a life in the wild. And that takes a really long time. It's a really long process in order to do that. It's not just a case of, a few weeks of preparing these animals and then just dropping them off in the jungle somewhere. It's really an involved process. Then also these good, these reputable places, of course, they have enough space for the animals to live in. They don't allow close encounters with tourists. That's incredibly important. Anywhere that allows you to touch or to take selfies with or to ride on any animal is an absolute no-no from the start. Somewhere that has proper veterinary care as well. So there's really quite a lot of factors.
A bit to it.
But for your uneducated or your uninformed consumer, it's very hard to know.
I was recently at Elephant Nature Park, and shout out to my friend Mahesh, if you're listening, bro. He's a vet there. He's a vet there. He's doing some awesome work. There's a lot of components to it, and complexities and nuances, which obviously probably make it a bit tricky for tourists as well. But I mean, that's just the reality of the problem. one thing I have noticed is some of these kind of more binary things, like if you're going to elephant sanctuary, it's kind of fairly, well, not completely known across the board, but a lot of people know, generally riding elephant is no good. But then if you go to some of these places, going back to the greenwashing thing, a lot of people then use that for marketing purposes. So there's a lot of people, sanctuaries that claim, they don't, on their pamphlets and on their websites, they're no riding. So as a tourist who wants to do the right thing, you see that and you're like, okay, yes, like I want to support one that supports no riding. And then you go there and maybe when you leave, some other things happen which aren't ideal. So it's a challenge.
Yeah, then there's the grey areas, like what about elephants being walked and washed? I mean, is that okay? So I think like a lot of the elephants, they've transitioned from this stage. I've seen it happen in Thailand a few times. Where it's like, okay, we're gonna ban elephant riding, but now tourists can walk the elephant to a waterfall or whatever and give them a scrub down. And of course, a lot of conservationists have issues with this. There's no doubt that it's better than forcing them to carry tourists around on their back. But there's still a lot of animal welfare concerns with these activities. So where do you draw the line?
Great question.
Yeah, I don't know. This is really for your elephant specialist to answer these questions. But I think probably any activity that encourages an animal to be touched or played with in that way, really we should just be out there and we should just be observing them as much as possible. And of course, for a tourist, that is less appealing because you want something tangible. You want to touch the skin. You want to run your hand down an elephant's trunk. Whereas, of course, that could be having many negative impacts on those elephants. Like, how have those elephants been trained to be that submissive? Something that the elephants go through as youngsters is called the crush, and where they will put them in wooden crates and they will beat them until they become completely submissive for days and days on end. And most of the elephants that you see at wildlife tourism attractions that are close interactions with humans have been through that process. So I would just say, as a kind of blanket rule, anything that allows you to be that close to an animal is a big no-no.
Exactly. And I think also a key that you mentioned is rehabilitation for sanctuaries and any kind of organization is that the focus? Is your focus rehabilitating the animal and putting them back to the wild? Because
yes.
I think we've got a little bit lost and we need to focus on putting them back in the wild. That's where they need to be. And I think the key motto has always been, sorry, you go.
I was just going to say, I'll give you a very good example about that. So there's a place in Zimbabwe called Antelope Park, and they bill themselves as a lion rescue and rehabilitation program. And they have this incredibly slick marketing team. You go there and you visit, and it's very Stepford Wives. It's all very manicured, and you have lots of young volunteers walking around who are paying thousands of dollars per month to go there and walk with the lions and in this volunteer program. And you go there and you ask them all the questions about where did they get their animals, what do they intend to do with them, and they have this very manufactured response about how they plan to, how their kind of model is to rescue, to rehabilitate, and then to release into the wild. And they have this 4-step program, but they've only ever got to step 2 of this 4-step program. And actually, because rehabilitating a lion and then releasing it into the wild is a huge job that takes massive resources, a lot of money and expertise, and isn't easy to do at all. So yeah, if you go there and you were to visit a tourist and you would see this animals that supposedly look healthy, and you would see this very kind of manicured production, then you would think it was a good thing for conservation. But I can tell you, if you do a little bit of poking behind the scenes, that the Antelope Park and many other establishments that operate in the same way are actually doing incredibly shady things behind the scenes.
And I love how you said then, well, I don't love it, but I think it's key that they've had the 4 steps and they've only managed to get to number 2.
Yeah.
And I think that happens a lot in wildlife tourism as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you had a lot of these places, I'm not going to point fingers at anyone specifically, but they're also involved in the illegal wildlife trade. And there's a lot of money to be made from this industry. So where are the animals coming from? Lots of animals will get stolen from the wild. You saw in our film, Eyes of the Orangutan, is that the mothers will get bludgeoned, they'll get hacked to pieces with machetes, and then the babies are stolen, and then they're sent to these centers. And then there's huge amounts of money to be made, for example, in carcasses and in lion and tiger bones. That industry is massive. You get thousands of dollars for a lion carcass. The bones are then sent to Asia, where they are boiled down, and they make tiger wine or tiger cake, which is another a massive industry. So I think when you're visiting these places, you always have to be asking yourself and asking the people who you are speaking to the pertinent questions, and then to be questioning as well. I think we accept things too easily and too readily, but go in there with a good skeptical mindset and ask the right questions, and don't necessarily accept all the answers that you're being given.
Yeah, and continue speaking up for the voiceless.
Exactly.
So with all these issues, how hopeful are you that we as humans can make positive change for animals and biodiversity?
Well, there was me at the start saying that we have to have a sense of hope. Otherwise, what's the point? Why do we carry on? You go through periods where you feel utterly hopeless and you think we're all doomed and wildlife is screwed and you're just going to throw in the towel. But that's not going to do any good for anyone. And for all of the negativity that we've touched upon during this chat, there are people who are out there who are dedicating their lives to conservation. And there are people who are really making an impact in the world, and without them, we really are doomed. So look, I do feel hopeful. There's lots of NGOs. There's lots of scientific research programs. There's lots of educators who have now really thrown the focus on animals, and that's been a real paradigm shift over recent years. That now conservation is at the forefront of people's minds in a way that it never was before, because we are at this tipping point. We are at a critical point in humanity that if we don't do something now, we are, we're in the midst of a biodiversity crisis, but we're going to get to a point of no return.
A lot of things to think
Blane,
about.
Do you have any questions before I go on to palm oil?
No, I think I'll marinate on a few things and I'll ask a couple of questions after. Yeah. You
can see your mind ticking over. There's so much to cover. I feel like we could all talk for hours upon all these issues. There's so many things that we're all passionate about.
So many issues,
not enough time.
So many subjects, so many problems, so many threats, so many species.
Yeah.
Really good podcast on each of these issues. Only so much time in the day, and we don't want to drive everyone to Valium and alcohol by making things too doom and gloom.
Yeah.
Let's move back to my favorite animal now, orangutans. Why I work for a palm oil free certification body. So at Orangutan Alliance, we certify companies, brands and products like food and cosmetics that are palm oil free and derivative free, because that's what we believe is an important role in tackling unsustainable palm oil, and as well as encouraging the development of alternatives to palm oil. In your opinion and through your experience, what do you believe is the key to addressing the palm oil crisis?
I think there's a number of ways of doing that. First of all, as you well know, palm oil isn't necessary in a lot of these products. So I think that you know, there are alternatives, or we just don't use them at all. But if you go onto the streets of Borneo or Indonesia, and you will just see everything is sodden with palm oil. Everything is cooked in 3 gallons of this stuff, and people don't necessarily know the impact that this is having on the environment. Of course, there's the role of education. I know it's always a bit wishy-washy to say, well, we need to educate people, but there needs to be more focused education programs, particularly within kind of local communities as well, so people understand the impact that the industry is having. But the huge problem with palm oil is that it's too good as a crop. It's too efficient. It's too versatile. And that's something that we are really up against. And we need to come up with alternatives to palm oil. And until we do, we're facing really an uphill battle. So yeah, I mean, I think the work that you guys are doing is integral. It's hugely important to helping educate people. But yeah, it's a big problem. And again, I don't want to speak out of turn because this really isn't my area of expertise. I'm just commenting on what I have seen.
And you would have seen a lot of palm oil plantations along the journey, I can imagine. I think everyone knows that the memory, if you have been there, when you fly over, say, Indonesia or Borneo, and you just see everywhere fields of palm oil plantations where there was before that pristine, amazing jungle and biodiverse life, and now it's just
but
nothing.
We also have to remember that, like, look at most of England was covered in beautiful forests before it was all chopped down for crops. So all over the world, deforestation is a massive problem. It's just the issue is with palm oil that you are replacing the habitat of particularly biodiverse, biologically rich areas with a monoculture, and that's essentially the issue. Yeah, with palm oil.
And it's just the one crop.
Yeah,
where
exactly.
we need to diversify.
Yeah, exactly. It's the one crop where a lot of wildlife fares very poorly in these plantations. Some of them fare too well, like elephants. You know, that's why so many elephants ended up being killed in Borneo, is because they actually survive very well in palm oil plantations, and they can destroy an entire crop in you know, a few days. So that's why they're ending up being shot or poisoned in these plantations. So yeah, it's a very complex, a very difficult issue. There is a role, I believe, for palm oil, and efforts are underway to try and do it in a more sustainable manner. Some people will say that there's no such thing as sustainable palm oil, but I take more of a pragmatic view that it's not going anywhere. It's here to stay because it's, as I touched upon, it's too good a crop. So therefore we have to work with you know, the government, we have to work with local wildlife enforcement agencies to ensure that we have as little impact on wildlife as humanly possible, and we mitigate some of the challenges that we're currently facing.
Interesting. I think you said the word complex a few times when referencing these problems, and I think that's kind of a word we all need to wrap our head around, because complex problems require, you know, maybe on paper they seem like simple solutions, but like in practice, you know, the implementation of it will be kind of complex and nuanced, and that just needs to be considered, because it is, it's not an easy fix.
You don't just want to be saying to people, no, you can't do this. You can't be
it's more than that.
The palm oil industry. You can't eat dogs. You can't be killing sharks, because that's not realistic, and it's not right either. And that's something that we're constantly battling with the stories that I'm putting out there. And you get a lot of people who there's just pure vitriol saying, how can these people be doing this? How can they be killing dogs? How can they be cutting down rainforests? But I can tell you that if you are hungry and you live in an area where there's thousands of stray dogs running around and your family and have been eating dogs for generations, who are we to go in there and say, no, this is terrible, you shouldn't be doing this? And yeah, same with the shark finning industry. I made a film about the shark finning industry in Mozambique, and conservationists who were going in there and saying, why are you killing sharks, and blaming the local fishermen. But if you're a local fisherman and you get $200 for a large shark, which is the equivalent of 3 months' wages, and it can help feed your entire family, you would do exactly the same thing. So yeah, we always have to approach these stories with from a journalistic perspective, where you are getting there's two sides to every story always. It's not just black and white, many shades of gray in between.
Yeah, a big sprinkling of empathy is required in all these sorts of things. And by that, I mean, kind of putting yourself in, when you're looking at a challenge, and maybe on the surface, it may seem easy to criticize someone for doing a particular thing. Just try and put yourself in their shoes. And usually there is actually some reasoning behind why they do what they do. And that's important to understand if you're actually going to address the root problem. Like, I mean, my girlfriend's a psychologist, and one thing we talk about is, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And at the bottom of that is, survival, the physical needs. And at the top of the pyramid, you have kind of self-actualization, kind of like optimizing your life. And if you're living at the bottom of the pyramid, kind of all you're concerned about is kind of surviving and then feeding your family. And me living where I'm living, I don't have to worry about that at all. So it's harder for me to relate to people that kind of, that's their day to day. And I think we just have to acknowledge that everyone's different. Everyone has their own situation, unique situation. And don't be so quick to criticize, because actually that's not very helpful. We need to kind of practice a bit of empathy.
Yeah, stop being a keyboard warrior. Get out there, go meet people, go and see these communities. Go, these aren't like, again, I keep going back to this dog meat trade job in Indonesia and Vietnam, because it was the most recent one I worked on. But you go and the people were incredibly nice. They were very welcoming. And they said, and like, why can't we eat dog in the same way that you guys eat pigs and cows and chickens? And we've been doing this forever. Who are you to tell us not to do it? And so then, from a campaign's perspective, it's about going in there and trying to kind of explain to people. Again, I'll head back to the shark meat example. So what we tried to communicate to these communities was that actually eating shark meat is very dangerous and it's very toxic. We took a sample from the shark and we sent it for testing in a laboratory, and I think they found out it had 2000% of the recommended daily amount of methyl mercury. So by catching the sharks for the Southeast Asian market and consuming the meat, they were not just poisoning themselves, but they were poisoning their families. And it was that actually went and made the impact. That was what stopped them going out and catching sharks and eating the meat, because it directly impacted them. It has to directly impact you. Or,
exactly.
Yeah. Or why should you care?
Yeah. It's that selfish gene sort of a thing. There's this, I always think about these things in terms of like the selfish gene that we have. Like, if you're trying to convince someone to do something else, and they need to believe that that thing is beneficial for them in some way, or else it's not going to happen.
Exactly. I remember a mate of mine saying, when I was working on the shark project, he was being a bit facetious, but he said, so what, if we lose sharks, then we've always got dolphins, does it matter? And I know he was kind of only joking and trying to wind me up, but that is the mindset that we are battling against.
Yeah. And it's literally like asking, how is protecting the planet going to benefit me as an individual? is the question, really. When for me, as a conservationist, as you both would adhere to and, you know, feel, is that protecting the planet and everything on it is more important than this one individual being.
Yeah, but how do we communicate that to people? And they're like,
exactly.
Look, I got 2 kids downstairs. I can barely afford to pay my electricity bills, and you're telling me that I should care about the planet. I've got more pressing things to worry about.
But there's a way to package that like answer. Like, I know, and this is where I probably differ to a lot of conservationists, but when I think of that, I also think about it in a selfish kind of perspective. And when I think about conserving the planet, that's actually a selfish thing to do. If your selfishness kind of extends, like, it depends on how you define that, but it's in my best interest for the planet to be healthy. Like, it's probably not a romantic way to think about it, but even from that point of view of the selfish gene, it actually does make sense to kind of look after the planet, make sure that the ecosystems are healthy, because that actually is better for you as well.
And better for any offspring that you have.
Exactly. So your time scale, if that's like beyond you, and you're looking after, thinking of your children and your children's children, it actually is very selfish to care about the planet. In a weird way. I know I get a bit if you're talking about it, but I think it's all about the packaging of it and how you are. But that's how I think about it a lot of the time.
Yeah, I like how you looped that around, because it can be either end. And I always say, you know, do it for your future generations. We want this world to be here and be sustainable and regenerative for future generations.
But, you know, in a lot of communities that I've visited, there's not even a word for future. They're not thinking about future generations.
Exactly.
They're thinking about the next meal.
Yeah, they're thinking about right now. So even thinking about the future is kind of like thinking about the future. You're kind of, by thinking about it, you're in this kind of privileged position where you can even think about that. So it's kind of,
it's a luxury to be able.
It's a luxury. Complex. We want to be kind of considerate of your time. We probably have maybe a question or two. Is that fine with you?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. Probably before you ask the final question, Amy, I just wanted to touch on maybe social media. I mean, so we talk about all these different things: exotic pet trade, wildlife trade, the dog meat trade, wildlife tourism. These are all kind of big issues. And one thing I find, I haven't been on Instagram really for a while now, but one thing I found when I was on there was, like, if I was posting something about chimpanzees or whatever, I'd type in the hashtag just to get a bit of inspo. And the images that pop up are not of chimpanzees in the wild, chimpanzees dressed up in human clothing, riding a skateboard. Obviously, this is not new to you. But what role does social media play in terms of influencing these sorts of negative things that currently exist within the kind of human animal domain? Like, what role does that play in that?
It's been a massive driver. It's been one of the biggest drivers of the wildlife tourism industry, because people want to go out there and they want to show the world what a great and adventurous life they're having, and they want to take photos in front of animals or at animal shows. And they've actually done studies, and the studies show that when people are visiting these wildlife tourism attractions, they do have animal welfare concerns. So they're watching, the chimpanzee on a skateboard, and they're thinking, oh, like, is this really a good thing? And I wonder where they got the animal from or how it's trained. And then the other part of their brain is thinking, well, I'm just going to take a photograph of myself with that chimpanzee, and won't it look great on social media? And they're doing this kind of balancing act in their mind. And then 99 times out of 100, the social media post, the selfish gene wins. So yeah, it's been a massive driver behind the wildlife tourism industry, and not enough is being done about it. That's quite clear. And that's the same with a lot of illegal wildlife trades as well. I mean, it boggles my mind that you can still go onto Facebook and you can still buy an orangutan or buy a baby chimpanzee. It's just absolutely crazy that they're essentially facilitating these trades. Instagram did kind of half-heartedly a while ago try and like flag some hashtags, specific hashtags like about tiger selfies, and put up warnings there. But it's really not, they're really not doing enough. And the industries while social media continues to be such an important part of our lives, it will continue fueling these industries.
Yeah, I think about this in terms like supply and demand. People, know about that within the business world, but that logic applies within kind of social media and content creation as well. Like if you post a piece of content and all the users are liking it and sharing it, you're just demanding those content creators or other content creators to kind of produce more of that content. So there is this, I think about it like a triangle of responsibility between, the social media platforms, say Facebook, Instagram. Another one would be the content consumers, but also the content creators. Like each three of those parties have like a role to play and changing things.
There has to be this shift, and it is taking place. And a while ago, for example, if you'd have gone on Tinder a few years back, you would see that half the pictures are of people posing with a tiger cub and feeding a tiger milk. But then slowly over recent years, as it's crept more into people's consciousness and people have become more aware of animal welfare issues, these sorts of behaviors are becoming more frowned upon and less socially acceptable. So I think that's kind of where we're currently at. We're at this kind of, I keep using the phrase tipping point, but because we are at such a crucial point where a lot of these behaviors because, or maybe I'm just so involved in the industry that I think that animal welfare is now something that people are paying more attention to. But I would say these days, it would be frowned upon for you to put a photograph on Instagram of you cuddling a baby tiger. So things are changing. It's just very, very slow. And elephant riding, if your average person was to put a photograph up of riding on an elephant, would there be people who were commenting and saying, look, this is something that you need to think about? I don't know. I don't know is the answer, but certainly from my perspective and the work that I've been doing, it seems like there is more awareness now.
Yeah, I think, definitely there's more awareness and the mentality is shifting for sure, I think. And they're shifting in the right direction.
Yeah, and I think with social media, it can be used and utilized for good in that way, because sharing these issues and saying, hey, this is not good, this is happening, and spreading that awareness rather than spreading images of yourself hugging an orangutan that should be in the wild, and saying that this is a very cute photo.
Yeah, there was a great scene.
It can be good.
Or a very eye-opening scene in Eyes of the Orangutan where we were interviewing people at Bali Zoo. And at Bali Zoo, they have this breakfast with the orangutans experience where they take these poor orangutans out and stick them on platforms whilst everyone's having this very lavish buffet. And then people take photographs with them and people are constantly grabbing them. And I mean, it's really shocking. It should not happen. And we just started speaking to some of the tourists who were there. And at first they were like, yeah, the animals look great. They look really happy. They look healthy. And then when you just start slowly asking them the questions, then you could see them questioning themselves when you were saying, oh, did you know that orangutans are very solitary? Like in the wild, they almost never encounter other orangutans, and they certainly never encounter people. How do you think it would feel for them? Or, you know, where do you think the orangutans might be coming from? And then when you were kind of planting these seeds with people, you could see their mindset shifting. So I think that's also the case with social media, when you can kind of start asking these questions of people for them to query their own decisions and animal welfare issues. That's better than kind of hitting them over the head with a sledgehammer.
I agree with that. 100%.
Exactly. Yeah, asking those questions and making people think. I think planting seeds is the best thing as well, with education and awareness. For a final question that we always love to ask at the Eco Impactors, based on the many experiences you've shared with our beautiful orangutan friends, what do you think are some of the important life lessons humans can learn from orangutans?
Oh, wow. You know, when I said I didn't want questions beforehand because I like them, I'm now wishing I'd had the questions beforehand. What are the life lessons we
You can have a second to think about it if you like. There's plenty.
All right, we have so much to learn from orangutans. They're one of our closest living relatives, and their maternal instincts, their empathy, their gentleness, their intelligence, their life out in the wild is something that we can all be inspired from. And, you know, if the world was just comprised of orangutans only, it would be a much happier place.